Welcome to Sleepy Love Tales, soothing romance for a restful night. If these stories help you unwind, be sure to subscribe. For now, close your eyes and let's begin tonight's story, The Voice Between Us. The air in the archival basement held its breath. Emma Wolfe had learned to work in silence, the kind that settled between heartbeats, that made the scratch of her restoration tool sound like thunder against the perpetual hush. Temperature, 65 degrees. Humidity, 40%. Light, minimal. Everything calibrated for preservation, for keeping the dead from crumbling further into dust. Down here, 3 stories beneath the university library, time moved differently. Slower, more reverent. Emma had been restoring early 20th century recordings for 4 years now. Her days spent in the company of voices that no longer belonged to bodies, singing songs for audiences long turned to ash. She'd learned to treat sound as artifact, to separate the technical from the emotional, to hear a voice without imagining the throat that produced it. Until today. She lifted the shellac disc from its sleeve with gloved hands, noting the wear patterns, the slight warp near the centre. 1936. Unmarked. Someone, probably her predecessor, who'd had no patience for incomplete cataloguing, had labelled it simply as unidentified soprano, Vienna, Puccini aria. The kind of mystery that should have intrigued her professionally, but instead sat in the to-be-researched pile for months. She almost hadn't played it, had a dozen other restorations waiting, each with proper provenance, each with actual historical value. But the sleeve was beautiful, Art Nouveau flowers fading into brown paper, and she'd been curious about the weight of it, the way it sat heavy in her hands like grief. Emma placed the disc on the turntable, set the needle with the precision of surgery, adjusted the horn's angle for optimal acoustics. She'd performed this ritual thousands of times. It should have felt routine. But the moment the needle found its groove and the voice emerged from the gramophone's brass throat, Emma knew. The voice was imperfect, breath audible between phrases, vibrato barely controlled, a hairline crack in the upper register where the soprano pushed too hard, wanted too much. Technically, it shouldn't move anyone. Technically, by every measure of professional training Emma had received, it was flawed. But Emma's hands stopped moving. The cotton swab she'd been using to clean another disc fell from her fingers, rolled across the workbench, dropped to the floor. She didn't notice. She knew this voice. Had heard it hum absently over breakfast tea, murmur recipes in German while kneading bread, go abruptly silent when memory pressed too close. For 26 years she'd lived with a grandmother who spoke little and sang never, who seemed to prefer the company of books to people, restraint to revelation, who wore silence like other women wore pearls. But this was her grandmother's voice, 50 years younger, unguarded, singing Tosca's desperate prayer, as though she believed someone was listening, as though love might be returned simply for being offered, as though the future hadn't yet taught her that some things once given could never be reclaimed. Vici date, vici d'amore, the voice sang. I lived for art, I lived for love. The past tense felt like prophecy. Emma played it again, and again. By the 4th repetition, she'd stopped pretending she was doing restoration work and admitted she was eavesdropping on a version of her grandmother she'd never been allowed to meet. That evening, Emma climbed the 3 flights to her grandmother's apartment with the unmarked sleeve in her bag and her heart performing arrhythmias. The building was pre-war, with radiators that clanked like percussion and hallways that smelled of cabbage and old carpet. Helene had lived here for 40 years, in the same rent-controlled 2-bedroom with the same furniture Emma remembered from childhood. Everything precisely placed, nothing excessive, each object earning its space through utility or beauty. Helene Wolfe sat by the window with her usual tea in her usual chair, spine straight as a blade, hands folded in her lap like a prayer no one would answer. At 73, she remained handsome rather than beautiful, her face all elegant bones and discipline. She wore her silver hair in a bun so severe it looked painful. Her posture suggested a woman who'd learned young that to bend was to break, so she'd simply stopped bending. She looked up when Emma entered, and something in her granddaughter's face must have signalled danger, because she set down the book she'd been reading, Rilke in German, always Rilke, without marking her place. "I found something today." Emma didn't sit, couldn't sit. She felt like she was confessing to a crime, though she couldn't name which one. A recording from Vienna, 1936. Helene's teacup paused halfway to her lips. The pause lasted 3 seconds, which was 2 seconds longer than necessary. 2 seconds during which Emma could see her grandmother calculating what to admit, what to deny, what truths could survive exposure to air. "Did you?" Not a question. Helene's voice remained steady, but her hand trembled microscopically against the china. Tea rippled like a seismograph detecting distant earthquakes. The singer used a false name, or no name at all. Emma waited, watching her grandmother's face for cracks. "But I know your voice, Omar. I've known it my entire life. It's you." The cup completed its journey. Helen drank, swallowed, set the china down with the precision of someone who'd learned to control everything but her past. When she finally met Emma's eyes, there was no denial in her face, only a stillness so complete it felt like confession, like the moment before a building collapses when all the weight shifts and everyone inside knows but cannot yet move. "What do you want to know?" Helene asked. "Everything," Emma thought. "Why you stopped? Why you never told me? Why you fled Vienna? Who was listening when you sang like that? Who taught you to sound like your heart was breaking in 3/4 time?" But what she said was, "Why does it sound like you're singing to someone who can't answer?" Helene's mouth softened at the corners. Not quite a smile, too knowing for grief, too ancient for mere sadness. Her eyes went distant, focusing on something 50 years past and an ocean away. "Because I was." The restoration became Emma's obsession, though she pretended otherwise. She told herself it was professional curiosity, a musicological puzzle, a mystery of attribution that needed solving. She submitted paperwork requesting extended access to specialized equipment. She drafted research proposals about anonymous Vienna performers. She created elaborate spreadsheets of plausible matches, but nights found her hunched over the workbench long after her colleagues had gone home, headphones pressed to her ears until they ached, learning to hear what lay beneath the notes, learning to hear her grandmother as a stranger, as a woman, as someone who'd once been young enough to believe in happy endings. Between the phrases she heard breath, not the controlled breathing of professional technique, but something more raw, more desperate. In the vibrato, hesitation. The aria was Puccini, Vici d'arte, Tosca's prayer before she murders the man who would rape her. But her grandmother sang it like a question no deity would answer. Like a woman asking why love and devotion must guarantee suffering, why purity of heart cannot protect against pain. Emma began to notice things a casual listener would miss, how the tempo pulled against itself, as though the singer wanted both to rush forward toward some imagined resolution and to linger in these last moments of not yet knowing. How certain words received more air, more weight. Vici d'arte, I lived for art. Vici d'amore, I lived for love. Non feci mai male ad anima viva. I never hurt a living soul. The past tense mattered. The defensive tone mattered more. On her third visit to her grandmother's apartment, each one scheduled now, formal, Emma bringing pastries from the Austrian bakery, Helene pretended not to care about but always ate. Helene started talking. I was nobody, she said, stirring sugar into tea with methodical precision. Daughter of a watchmaker in Graz. He fixed timepieces for people who could afford to care about minutes. Voice lessons paid for by a patron who heard me sing in church and thought I had potential worth investing in. I had technique but no connections, no name that mattered, no family with money or influence. So when the Staatsoper offered me small roles, walk-ons, understudies, chorus work, I took them. I was grateful. Do you understand? Actually grateful to scrub floors in exchange for the chance to sing Carmen Cigarette Girls. And the alias? Protection. For him, primarily, but also for myself. Helene's fingers traced the rim of her teacup, around and around, a gesture. So unconscious, Emma wondered how many thousands of times she'd performed it, working anxiety into porcelain. In Vienna, reputation was currency. A soprano who sang well and behaved properly might advance, might catch the eye of important directors, might be invited to auditions that mattered. A soprano who loved unwisely would disappear, not dramatically, not with scandal, just quietly. No more roles, no more recommendations. The opera world is small, Emma. Everyone knows everyone. Shame travels faster than talent. Emma heard the edit in that sentence, the word scandal replaced with something softer, the way you learn to talk around old wounds. Who was he? The conductor. Helene said it without hesitation, as though the secret had been aging so long in silence it no longer stung to speak aloud, as though after 50 years the statute of limitations on heartbreak had finally expired. Maximilian Adler. Everyone called him Max. Married, prominent, Jewish, though this was 1935, 1936, and such things weren't yet openly dangerous the way they would become. He conducted with the precision of a mathematician and the heart of a poet, which shouldn't be possible but was. I fell in love with his hands first, how they shaped silence into meaning, how they could make an orchestra breathe as one body. Emma tried to picture it, her grandmother young, in love, singing night after night for a man who couldn't claim her, couldn't even applaud her without revealing too much. Did he know? Oh, he knew. Helene's smile turned rueful. Music doesn't lie, Emma. You cannot sing Puccini for a man and pretend indifference. Every rehearsal was a conversation we couldn't have in words. Every performance was a love letter I couldn't send. The intimacy of it struck Emma physical. How desire could live entirely in the space between baton and breath, between his direction and her voice. How two people could be lovers without ever touching. Did you ever kiss him? Helene asked. Almost. Once. After a particularly successful Tosca, I'd sung better than I ever knew I could. Found notes I didn't know I possessed, sustained phrases that should have been impossible. The audience wouldn't stop applauding. 14 curtain calls, flowers covering the stage. The director was ecstatic, already talking about extending my contract. She paused, poured more tea with hands that still, after all these years, knew exactly how to avoid trembling. But all I could think was that Max had pulled that performance from me, had conducted me into transcendence. I'd watched his hands all night, followed every gesture, every subtle shift in tempo, and somehow he'd made me more than I was. That's what a great conductor does. He doesn't just lead, he transforms. What happened after? We were alone in the rehearsal room. The orchestra had packed up and left. The stage crew was striking sets, but the music wing was empty. We stood in this bubble of aftermath, both of us still trembling with adrenaline, with the memory of what we'd just created together. Helene's eyes closed, and Emma knew she was seeing it again. Not remembering, but actually seeing, the way trauma stays vivid but joy fades unless you tend it. He stood close enough that I could smell the pomade in his hair, bay rum, old-fashioned even then. Could see where he'd cut himself shaving that morning. There was a tiny piece of tissue paper still stuck to his jaw, brown with dried blood. I wanted to remove it, wanted to touch him so badly my hands actually ached. Did you? No, but I wanted to. God, how I wanted to. His hand came up. She demonstrated, palm hovering beside her own face, fingers extended but not quite making contact. He was going to cut my cheek. I could see the intention in his body, the way his weight shifted forward, and I knew if he touched me, I would lean into it, would turn my face into his palm, would cross whatever boundary we'd been maintaining between professional and personal. So what stopped you? He did. His hand just stopped, hung there in the air between us, close enough that I could feel the heat of his skin across the gap, could hear his breathing change, deepen. We stood there for what felt like hours, but was probably 30 seconds. Time does strange things when you're that close to something you want but can't have. Then what? Someone applauded from the balcony, one of the cleaning staff who'd stayed late to watch rehearsal, an old woman, probably 60, 70. She'd seen the whole thing, or enough of it, and just like that, we remembered where we were, who we were, what we couldn't be. Max dropped his hand, took 2 steps back, said, "Excellent work tonight, Fräulein Weber," in this perfectly professional voice, and walked away. Did he look back? No, neither of us did. Looking back would have been acknowledgement, and we couldn't afford that. How long did this go on? Season. Autumn through spring. September 1935 to May 1936. Helene's voice went distant, as though reading dates from a ledger that had been locked away for decades. 8 months of singing with a man who heard me more clearly than anyone ever has before or since. 8 months of being known in a way that had nothing to do with words. She refilled both their teacups, though neither had finished the first pour. That was the real intimacy, you understand. Not touch, but recognition. He knew my voice better than I knew it myself. Could tell from the first warm-up note of rehearsal whether I'd slept well the night before, whether I was happy, whether I was thinking of him. And I could read him through his conducting. Desire in the tempo he set, always slightly faster when he was agitated, when he'd been thinking about me. Frustration in how hard he struck the downbeat. Longing in the spaces he left between movements, the silences that lasted 1 beat too long. You never talked. About it? Once. Only once. It was December, snowing. Vienna was beautiful in that way that makes you forget about politics and danger. We were in his office after everyone had left. He was marking scores and I was supposed to be leaving, but I lingered. Finally he said, without looking up, "This cannot continue." "What did you say?" I said I know, because I did know. We both knew. It was unsustainable, this thing we were doing. This almost love, this maybe affair that existed only in music. But knowing something should end and being able to end it are 2 different things. So it continued. For 5 more months, through Christmas, I spent it alone in my boarding room, imagining him with Eva and her family. Through carnival season, when the whole city pretended to be happy. Through Lent, when we sang more sacred music and I had to pretend Handel's passion settings weren't about the agony of unconsummated love. And then came March, the Anschluss. Everything changed. Emma waited. This was the part of history she knew from textbooks, but she'd never considered how her grandmother had lived through it, what it had meant personally. The Nazis marched in on March 12th. Within days, Jewish musicians were being dismissed. Max got his notice on March 15th. He had 2 weeks to settle his affairs and leave the country. The Philharmonic, this orchestra he'd built, musicians he'd trained, they just let him go. Some of them had been his friends. They gave him a farewell dinner, shook his hand, wished him well, and went back to work under new management. Her voice had gone flat, factual, as though emotion would complicate the telling. He came to find me 3 days before he was supposed to leave for London, asked me to come with him, said he'd leave Eva with her family. They had money, connections, she'd be safe. We could go to London together, To America. Anywhere. He said, "I love you," for the first time out loud after 8 months of saying it. Through music. What did you say? I said no. Emma found the conductor's name in a margin note on a score tucked inside the recording sleeve. For H. You sang like you understood. Signed, M. Adler, Maximilian Adler. She found him in the Vienna Philharmonic archives, conductor from 1933 to 1938, when he fled to London ahead of the Anschluss. Married to Eva Adler, née Blumenthal, daughter of a prominent banking family. No children. Emma brought the score to her grandmother's apartment on a Thursday evening. Helene took it in her hands like it might detonate. "You knew Ava," Emma said. There wasn't a question. Everyone knew Ava. Helene's thumb traced the margin note. Beautiful, intelligent, fragile in ways that weren't visible until you looked closely. Her family had already lost one daughter to melancholy, the kind that ends in bathtubs and opened veins. Eva was delicate. The marriage protected her in multiple ways. Did she know about you? I don't know. Max never said. But I think, yes. I think she knew and chose to say nothing because the alternative was worse. Helene set the score down carefully. He loved her, Emma. Not the way he loved me, perhaps, but love nonetheless. He loved her gently, protectively, the way you love something precious that might break. And you? I loved recklessly, completely, the way you love when you're 23 and believe desire alone can remake the world. Helene's laugh was soft, bitter. He asked me to leave with him in March of 1938, when it became clear what was coming. He said we could go to London, to America, anywhere. He would leave Eva with her family's money and protections. We would be free. But you didn't go. No. Why? Helene stood, walked to the window. Outside, rain had started. The kind of thin, persistent rain that made the city look like a memory of itself. Because Eva would have died, she said finally. Not metaphorically, not eventually. Within the year, I think. And Max would have known it was our fault. Mine and his, and that knowledge would have poisoned everything we built together. Love cannot survive that kind of blood. Emma felt something shift in her chest. A recalibration of what she thought was a romance into something more complex, more devastating. Did you tell him that? I told him I wouldn't be the reason he became a man who could abandon his wife to her death. That some loves cannot be consummated without destroying what makes them worth having. Helene turned from the window. He wept. I'd never seen him weep before. Then he kissed me, once, on the forehead, like a benediction, and left. And the recording, made the week before, he wanted something to remember me by. I wanted something to remember who I'd been when I could still choose love over survival. The weight of that sentence settled over the room like snow. 3 weeks after learning about Eva, after understanding the full architecture of her grandmother's sacrifice, Emma confronted the question she'd been avoiding. Why had Helene given up music entirely? Not just the false name, not just Vienna, not just Max Adler, but singing itself. The voice that had moved audiences, that had made a man willing to remake his entire life. She found Helene in the small shared garden behind the apartment building, deadheading roses with surgical precision. It was early September, the air carrying that particular combination of warmth and melancholy that comes just before autumn. Helene wore gardening gloves and her usual cardigan despite the heat, as though she needed armour even against flowers. "Tell me about the last time you saw him," Emma said without preamble. Helene's hands stilled on the shears. A bloom, half dead, hung suspended from her fingers. She didn't turn around. "I wondered when you'd ask that question. Was it the night you made the recording?" "No, that was professional, formal. We both knew we were creating an artifact, preserving something that was already past tense." Helene set down the shears with deliberate care, removed her gloves finger by finger. The last time was 3 days before he left Vienna, April 10th, 1938. I remember because it was a Sunday, and the churches were full of people praying for things prayer couldn't fix anymore. The weather was unseasonably warm, spring pretending summer would last forever. She sat down on the garden bench, and Emma sat beside her, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. He came to my apartment, my boarding room really. One room, shared bath down the hall, the kind of place where ambition lives before it either succeeds or starves. We'd never been alone there before. It felt dangerous, improper, exposing. But propriety seemed absurd given what we were about to lose. Helene's voice dropped, became almost private, the way you speak when confession requires quiet. He stood in my doorway and said, "One night, give me one night, to remember when I'm old and you're a stranger." And I knew what he was asking, not for comfort, not for conquest, for the right to hold one perfect thing before letting it go forever. Emma held her breath, afraid that speaking would break whatever spell was allowing her grandmother to finally tell this. So I let him in. The garden seemed to lean closer, the roses bending as if to listen. We didn't speak much at first. Words would have made it negotiable, conditional, subject to second thoughts we couldn't afford. Instead, we moved like we were still in the opera house, him conducting, me responding, both of us performing the most important scene of our lives. Helene's hands clasped in her lap, and Emma saw they were trembling, as though the memory still had physical weight. He touched me the way he conducted, precisely, reverently, as though I were music made flesh. Started with my face, traced my cheekbones, my jaw, the line of my neck, memorizing, then my hands, turning them over, examining my fingers, the way they curved and rested. "Beautiful," he said. Just that one word. Beautiful. Emma felt heat rise in her own chest. Not embarrassment, but recognition. This was what love looked like when it finally found its body after months of pure restraint. I'd thought intimacy was knowing someone's mind, understanding their thoughts, Helen continued. But that night I learned it's also knowing someone's body, how they breathe when desperate, what sounds they make when careful control finally breaks. He undressed me slowly, his hands learning the geography of skin the way his ears had learned my voice. Every touch felt like permission granted, like a question answered yes. She paused, choosing her words with care. We made love on my narrow bed with the window open and Vienna's spring air cooling our skin. He moved inside me like he was trying to memorize the rhythm, and I found myself singing, actually singing, soft and wordless, against his shoulder. Not performance, not technique, just pure sound, pure feeling. Afterwards we lay tangled together, his hand over my heart, feeling it slow back to normal. Helene opened her eyes, looked at Emma directly. "This," he said, "this is what I'll remember. Not the fear, not the leaving, this." And I knew he was right. We'd taken one perfect thing from a world determined to destroy us, and we'd made it ours. No regime could take that. No distance could erase it. Did he stay the night? Until dawn. We didn't sleep much. Mostly we talked. Actually talked. For the first time without codes or music. He told me about growing up in Munich, about the first time he heard Mahler and realised sound could be architecture. I told him about singing in my father's watch shop, how the ticking used to drive me mad until I learned to use it as rhythm. She smiled, and it was genuine. When the sun came up, he got dressed, kissed me once, properly this time deeply, then he walked to the door and said, "If there's a recording someday, will you listen and remember I loved you?" And I said yes. And he left. I watched him from the window until he turned the corner. He didn't look back. We'd agreed he wouldn't. "And you never sang again." Helene smiled. A real smile this time, sad but not broken. I sang that night. For him. With him. In a way that had nothing to do with audiences or applause. That felt like enough. Emma understood then. Her grandmother hadn't given up music. She'd transformed it, made it private, made it holy. What happened to Eva? She survived. Max got her to London, then to New York. I heard through mutual acquaintances that she lived until 1965, longer than anyone expected. They never divorced. He never remarried after she died. I think he kept his promise to her, in his way. And you? I came to America, changed my name. Helene instead of Helena, Wolf instead of Weber. Learned to be ordinary, married your grandfather because he was kind and didn't ask about my past. Raised your mother, raised you, lived quietly. She picked up the shears again, returned to the roses. But sometimes, late at night, I'll hum that aria, and I'm 23 again, singing for a man who heard everything I meant. That doesn't fade, Emma. Love like that doesn't diminish with age. It just becomes part of your architecture. Emma spent 2 months restoring the recording to the best fidelity 1936 technology and 2025 digital restoration could achieve. She removed surface noise, balanced the frequencies, brought her grandmother's voice forward from the static. But she left in the breath, the hesitation, the places where emotion fractured technique. Those imperfections were the truth. She presented it to Helene on a Sunday morning, in the garden where roses bloomed despite the late season. The recording was now digitized, remastered, saved to a simple USB drive. I'm going to archive this properly, Emma said. Not under your false name, not as unidentified, as Helene Wolf, née Weber, soprano, Vienna, 1936. No, Helene said gently. Keep the alias. That woman, Helena Stern. She belongs to that moment. To him. Let her remain there. Emma understood. Some loves were too large to be filed correctly, too private to be made public record. Then I'll file it as anonymous soprano, Vienna 1936, rare recording, and I'll put in the notes that it's technically imperfect but emotionally devastating. Helene laughed, a real laugh, bright and unexpected. Emotionally devastating. Yes, I like that. They sat together in the garden, 2 women separated by decades but connected by understanding. Emma thought about all the loves that never made it into history books, all the intimacies preserved only in silence and memory. Do you regret it, she asked, not going with him? Helene considered this with the seriousness it deserved. No, because the love I had with Max was perfect, precisely because we didn't try to make it domestic. It stayed wild, immediate, untested by years and arguments and the small erosions of daily life. We got to love each other at our best. That's rare. But you gave up so much. I gave up one future for another. I gained your mother. You. This garden. A life that was mine, not borrowed or stolen. That's not nothing. Emma reached for her grandmother's hand. The same hand that once gestured so precisely on stage, that later kneaded bread and braided hair, and held her when she cried. Thank you for telling me. Thank you for asking, Helene squeezed back, and for understanding that some stories take a lifetime to be ready for telling. That afternoon, Emma returned to the archive. She catalogued the recording with its anonymous designation, filed it in the temperature-controlled vault where fragile things were kept safe from decay. But she also made a copy, unofficial, unmarked. She gave it to Helene on her 80th birthday, along with a small, expensive record player. In case you ever want to hear yourself young again, Emma said. Helene accepted it with hands that trembled slightly. Age, not emotion. That night, alone in her apartment with a cup of tea going cold on the side table, Helene played the recording once. just once. Her younger self sang Tosca's prayer with desperate, imperfect beauty, asking why love and art must hurt so much, why devotion guarantees suffering, why giving everything still isn't enough. She listened to the end, to where the orchestra swelled and her voice climbed towards something transcendent despite the technical flaws. Then she turned off the player and sat in the dark, remembering not the opera house with its velvet and gilt, not the audience with their applause and flowers, but a small boarding room in Vienna with spring air coming through the window and a man's hand over her heart, counting her pulse like it was the only music that mattered. This is what I'll remember, he'd said. Not the fear, not the leaving. This. And sitting there in the dark, 80 years old and alone but not lonely, joints aching with the ordinary betrayals of age, Helene realised he'd been right. Some loves don't need completion to be perfect. Some intimacies don't require possession to be real. Some music sounds better for being imperfect, for showing the breadth and effort and humanity behind the notes. The recording existed, flawed, anonymous, filed away where almost no one would ever hear it. The memory existed, private, perfect, preserved not in shellac but in the architecture of her bones. The garden bloomed outside her window, roses she'd planted, tended, dead-headed season after season, making beauty out of the ordinary work of living. Her granddaughter knew her story now, not all of it perhaps, but enough to understand that silence isn't always weakness, that some loves survive precisely because they were chosen, consciously and devastatingly chosen. That was enough, more than enough. It was everything. And somewhere across an ocean and 50 years she imagined Max Adler, long dead now, his hands that once shaped sound stilled forever, had thought so too, had kept his one perfect night as she had kept hers, had lived a good life, a kind life, a life that honoured both his promises, the one he made to Eva at an altar, and the one he made to Helena in a shabby boarding room with spring air cooling their skin. Some loves, Helen thought, you carry in your chest like a second heartbeat, and that's exactly where they belong. The end. What we renounced. The conference hall in Geneva smelled of filtered air and ambition. Outside, Lake Leman lay grey and impassive beneath October clouds, while inside 200 delegates debated the calculus of survival. How many calories per person per day? Which border crossings could remain open? Whether dignity could be quantified in metric tons of grain? Dr. Mira Curie had attended 17 such summits in the past decade. She knew the rhythm, the opening addresses thick with statistics, the breakout sessions where real decisions were made in euphemism, the late-night emails sent to camps where mothers queued for water with infants on their hips. She had learned not to expect transformation, only incremental mitigation. Hope was a luxury she had surgically excised somewhere between her second and third deployment. She was reviewing case files in the atrium when she heard his voice. Not the words. Those were diplomatic, measured, directed at a cluster of EU observers, but the timbre, the particular weight he gave to certain syllables, the pause before difficult truths. She knew that voice the way one knows the sound of rain on a childhood roof, not by conscious memory, but by the body's involuntary response. Mira did not turn immediately. She finished reading the paragraph about malnutrition rates in the eastern camps, closed the folder with deliberate care, and only then allowed herself to look. 13 years had carved new lines beside his eyes. His hair, once uniformly dark, now showed silver at the temples. He wore a suit that fit too well, the armour of someone who had learned to move in rooms where power was a language spoken in nods and strategic silences. But his hands, those were unchanged. long fingers, a small scar on his left thumb from the time he'd helped her move medical supplies in the rain, and dropped a crate on his own hand. Daniel Roth, the man who had chosen history over her and been right to do so, and broken her anyway. He saw her perhaps 2 seconds after she saw him. The recognition moved across his face like wind over water, a moment of absolute stillness followed by something she couldn't name. Not quite pleasure, not quite pain. The complicated relief of seeing someone who knows exactly how much you've survived. "Dr. Curie," he said, crossing the atrium with that same measured stride. "I didn't know you'd be attending." "Mr. Roth." She extended her hand. His grip was firm, professional, and lasted precisely 1 second longer than protocol required. "I wasn't certain you still involved yourself in field operations." A flicker of something, irony, regret, crossed his features. "I find I can't quite abandon old habits." They stood in the atrium's calculated light, surrounded by the hum of translated conversations and the soft click of laptop keys. 13 years compressed into the space between their bodies. 13 years since the border city, since the makeshift hospital, since the night he'd told her he was leaving for the capital, for politics, for the chance to change policy rather than simply witness its failures. She'd understood, even then, had even agreed, in the theoretical way one agrees that amputations sometimes save lives. Understanding didn't prevent the wound. "You look well," Daniel said, and she heard what he didn't say. "You look like you survived." "So do you," Mira replied, meaning, "You look like success tastes exactly as bitter as you feared." The summit's architecture forced proximity. Mira served on the medical advisory panel. Daniel chaired the Intergovernmental Working Group on Food Security. Their meetings overlapped, their briefings converged, their recommendations required coordination. By the third day, they had fallen into an old rhythm, her clinical assessments complementing his strategic frameworks, her refusal to soften data balancing his need to find politically viable solutions. On the fourth evening, they found themselves sharing a car to a dinner with regional representatives. Rain streaked the windows. Geneva's streets glowed with wet light. "Do you remember," Daniel said quietly, "the night it rained in the camp, when the medical tent flooded and we moved everything to the administrative building?" Mira watched the city slide past. "I remember you carried 12 boxes of antibiotics on a sprained ankle and refused to admit you were injured. You noticed. I was a medical student. Noticing was my job. You were more than that." His reflection in the window met hers. "You saw things the rest of us had learned not to see." She didn't answer immediately. The silence between them had texture, weight. Finally, "I saw that you would leave. I was right about that." "Yes." No deflection, no defence. "You were." The dinner was interminable. Courses arriving with diplomatic precision, conversations circling the same territorial disputes, the same funding shortfalls, the same careful avoidance of the word failure. Mira sat 3 seats from Daniel and felt the distance like a physical ache. Twice their eyes met across the table. Once his hand moved toward his water glass at the same moment hers did, and they both stopped. The near collision somehow more intimate than touch. Later, much later, she found herself alone in the hotel lounge, too restless for sleep. She was reading incident reports when Daniel appeared, still in his dinner clothes, tie loosened. "May I?" He gestured to the chair across from hers. She nodded. They sat in silence for a long moment. Outside, the city's lights reflected on the lake, doubling themselves. "I kept your letter," Daniel said finally. "The one you wrote after I left." Mira's hand stilled on her tablet. "I never sent a letter." "I know. I found it in the medical tent after you'd been reassigned. It was in your handwriting, addressed to me unsealed. You must have set it down and forgotten it. or decided against sending it. He paused. I've never. Read it. She felt something crack in her chest. 13 years, and you never. I was afraid, he said simply. Afraid it would confirm what I already knew. That I'd chosen wrong. That I'd sacrificed something irreplaceable for something merely important. And now? Now I know I was right to be afraid. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, hands clasped. Mira, I've brokered treaties, prevented famines, moved millions of dollars of aid. I've done exactly what I set out to do. And not a day has passed when I didn't wonder what would have happened if I'd stayed. She should have been angry. Should have reminded him that wondering changed nothing, that good intentions were just another form of poverty, that she had built an entire life on the foundation of his absence. Instead, she heard herself say, the letter wasn't what you think. What was it? It wasn't an accusation. It was... She searched for the right word. It was a release. I was giving you permission to leave, without guilt. Telling you that I understood, that I would be fine, that your work mattered more than my feelings. She met his eyes. I was lying, of course, but it was a kind lie. You were always kind, Daniel said softly, even when kindness was the most expensive thing you owned. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of everything they hadn't said, hadn't allowed themselves to say. The air between them felt charged, magnetic. Mira was acutely aware of the distance between their chairs, less than 2 feet, more than an ocean. She was aware of his breathing, of the way his fingers had tightened on each other, of the small muscle working in his jaw. I should go, she said, not moving. Yes, Daniel agreed, staying precisely where he was. Neither of them moved. The moment stretched, taut and trembling. Then Daniel stood, slowly, and extended his hand to help her up. It was a gesture from another era, courtly and careful. She took his hand. He drew her to her feet. They stood closer than they'd stood since the day he left. Close enough that she could see the exact shade of his eyes. Not quite brown, not quite gold. That particular amber that had once seemed to her the colour of honesty. Good night, Mira, he said, releasing her hand. Good night, Daniel. She left first, feeling his gaze follow her to the elevator. In her room, she stood at the window for a long time, watching the lake, trying to remember why renunciation had once seemed noble rather than simply wasteful. The crisis came on the 7th day of the summit, during a closed session on resource allocation. Daniel presented the working group's final recommendations. On paper, they were brilliant. A graduated system that would stabilize food distribution across 17 camps, leveraging existing infrastructure while creating sustainable supply chains. It would save thousands of lives. It would also require closing 3 humanitarian corridors and consolidating resources in centralized distribution points. The vulnerable populations in the smaller, more remote camps would have to relocate or accept reduced provisions for a transitional period of 4 to 6 months. Mira listened to the presentation in mounting disbelief. When Daniel finished, she raised her hand. Dr. Khoury, the moderator acknowledged. I have a question about the transitional period. Her voice was calm, clinical. Has the working group considered the medical implications of relocating populations that include acute malnutrition cases, untreated tuberculosis, and pregnant women in their 3rd trimester? Daniel's expression didn't change. We've factored in medical considerations. The relocation will be phased and supported. Supported how? With what staff? The camps you're proposing to close house the medical personnel who've been treating those populations for years. The centralized points are already operating at capacity. The efficiencies gained from consolidation would free up resources in 4 to 6 months, Mira cut in. What happens in month 2, month 3, when women miscarry because they're travelling in the back of trucks? when children die of entirely preventable infections because the clinic that knew their medical history no longer exists? The room had gone very quiet. Daniel's jaw tightened. Dr. Curie, I understand your concerns, but the alternative is systematic collapse. If we don't consolidate now, there won't be any clinics in 6 months. Not in the remote camps, not anywhere. That's a hypothesis, Mira said. What I'm describing is a certainty. It's a calculated risk. It's a death sentence phrased in the passive voice. They stared at each other across the conference table. 13 years collapsed into nothing. They were back in the border city, back in the argument they'd had the night before he left. His conviction that systemic change required impossible choices. Her insistence that impossible choices had names and faces and medical histories. The moderator intervened, calling for a recess. Delegates filed out, murmuring. Mira gathered her materials with shaking hands. She was halfway to the door when Daniel caught up with her in the corridor. Mira, please, don't. She turned on him. Don't ask me to understand. I've spent 13 years understanding why you left, why you chose policy over people, why you convinced yourself that distance equals objectivity. I understood it all, Daniel. I forgave it all. But I will not watch you do it again. This isn't the same, he said, and she could hear the desperation beneath his control. Then I had a choice. Now I'm out of choices. The funding isn't there. The political will isn't there. If I don't propose this compromise, someone else will propose something worse. So you've absolved yourself before you've even acted. Mira's voice was cold now, surgically precise. How convenient. That's not fair. Fair? She laughed, a sound without joy. Daniel, you've built an entire career on being the reasonable one, the pragmatic one. The one who makes the hard choices so others don't have to. But there's a word for what you're doing, and it isn't pragmatism. It's cowardice. She saw the words land, saw him flinch. Good. She wanted him to flinch. She wanted him to feel something other than the terrible calm of the morally certain. You don't understand, he said quietly. You've never had to make these decisions. No, Mira agreed. I've only had to live with their consequences. I've held the children you decided weren't worth saving. I've told the mothers that yes, help is coming. Just hold on a little longer, knowing it was a lie. I've done the work you were too important to do. I know. His voice cracked just slightly. Mira, I know. Do you think I don't know? They stood in the corridor, close enough to touch, separated by everything that mattered. I'm withdrawing from the summit, Mira said. I won't lend my credibility to this. If you leave, it changes nothing. The policy will still pass. I know, she said, but I'll be able to live with myself. She walked away then, and didn't look back. In her hotel room, she packed methodically, checking flight options, composing her resignation email to the medical advisory board. Her hands were steady. She'd survived Daniel Roth once before. She could survive him again. What surprised her was how much it still hurt. How, after all these years, all this careful distance, the wound was exactly where she'd left it. 3 weeks later, Mira was in her apartment in Berlin when her phone rang. An unknown number. She almost didn't answer. Dr. Curie, it's Daniel Roth. She closed her eyes. How did you get this number? I asked someone who cared less about professional ethics than I should have. A pause. I'm in Berlin. The summit concluded yesterday. The policy passed, if you were wondering. I wasn't. A lie. She'd check the summit. Proceedings daily, hating herself for it. Could I see you? Just to talk. I'm flying out tomorrow morning. She should have said no. Should have told him that they'd said everything there was to say, that talk was just another form of postponement. Instead, where are you? The Adlon. Well, I can come to you if... No. Her apartment was too small, too personal. I'll come to you. Give me an hour. She dressed carefully, as if for surgery. clean lines, dark colours, nothing that could be misinterpreted. On the U-Bahn, she practiced the things she would say, calm things, final things, the conversation that would let them both move on. The hotel lobby was all marble and muted gold. Daniel was waiting in one of the leather armchairs, still in his conference clothes, but somehow diminished, as if the past weeks had taken something from him. He stood when he saw her. "Thank you for coming," he said. "I wasn't sure you would." "I wasn't sure either." They took the elevator in silence. His room was on the 7th floor, a suite with a view of the Brandenburg Gate. It was the kind of room where history was made in careful increments. Mira stood by the window, arms crossed, waiting. "The policy you opposed," Daniel said from behind her. "It was modified. Not enough, probably not nearly enough by your standards, but the transitional period was extended to 9 months. Additional mobile medical units were allocated, and there's a provision for emergency exceptions." "Because I left?" "Because you were right." He moved closer, but not close enough to touch. "And because enough other people were brave enough to say so. You started something when you walked out, Mira. You made it possible for others to object." "That's a political answer," she said. "I asked you for the truth. The truth is that I spent 3 weeks defending a policy I didn't believe in, because I was too afraid to admit I was wrong. The truth is that I've spent 13 years making pragmatic compromises and calling it wisdom. The truth is," his voice faltered, "the truth is that I left you once because I thought I could do more good without you than with you, and I've regretted it every single day since." Mira turned to face him. "Don't do this." "Don't do what?" "Don't rewrite history because you're lonely. Don't turn this into a romance because you've had a crisis of conscience." Her voice was fierce, protective of something she couldn't name. "You made the right choice, Daniel. You've saved lives. You've changed policy. Everything you've done has mattered. And what if it wasn't enough?" He stepped closer. "What if I saved thousands and lost the one thing that made me human?" "Stop." She held up a hand. "Just stop. I've survived you once. I've built a life. A good life. I don't need you to validate it or complicate it or—" "I love you," he said. The words fell into the space between them like stones into deep water. Mira stood very still. "I've always loved you," Daniel continued, quieter now. "I loved you when I left. I loved you when I didn't read your letter. I loved you in every meeting, every negotiation, every time I made a choice that required me to forget what it felt like to be fully human. And I know that saying it now after all this time is unfair and selfish and probably too late. But I'm tired, Mira. I'm tired of choosing the world over the person I love." "You can't," she whispered. "You can't do this. You can't just— I know I have no right. But I need you to know that it wasn't lack of love that made me leave. It was having too much love and no faith that I deserved to keep it." Mira felt something breaking in her chest, something she'd sealed over years ago with scar tissue and deliberate amnesia. "And what do you want from me now?" "Forgiveness. Permission. I want—" He stopped, struggling for words. "I want one moment where I don't choose duty over desire, where I don't calculate costs and benefits, where I just—" He reached for her hand, slowly, giving her time to pull away. She didn't. "Where I just choose you." His thumb traced a small circle on her palm. Such a tiny gesture. 13 years of longing compressed into that small, repetitive motion. "Daniel," she said, and his name in her mouth felt like coming home and burning alive all at once. "This won't fix anything. I know. It won't change the policy or the past or the fact that you'll leave again because that's who you are. I know. And I can't promise you anything. I can't promise I won't regret this tomorrow, or hate you for making me feel this again, or—" He kissed her. Not frantically, not desperately. Slowly, carefully. with the reverence of someone touching something they'd believed forever lost. His hand cupped her face, thumb brushing her cheekbone. She tasted salt and didn't know if it was from his tears or hers. When they broke apart, she was shaking. "I never stopped," she said against his mouth. "I never stopped loving you, and I hated myself for it. And I still... I know," he breathed. "I know." He kissed her again, deeper this time, and she felt 13 years of careful distance collapse into hunger. Her fingers found his tie, loosened it with trembling hands. He made a sound low in his throat when she pulled it free, when her hands moved to his collar. Each button she opened felt like a confession. They moved to the bed, not with passion, but with something older, more fundamental. Permission. Witness. The acknowledgement that some hungers survive on denial but die from starvation. Daniel's hands found the zipper at the back of her dress. He drew it down so slowly she thought she might shatter from anticipation. The fabric whispered as it fell away. His fingers traced the line of her spine, each vertebra a point of contact that made her breath catch. When he reached the small of her back, he pressed his palm there, spanning the width of her, and she felt claimed in a way that had nothing to do with possession and everything to do with recognition. "You're shaking," he said softly. "So are you." He was. She could feel it in his hands as he touched her, could see it in the tight control of his breathing. She reached for him, fingers working the buttons of his shirt with more urgency now. She needed to see him, needed to map the ways time had changed him, needed proof that this was real. When his shirt fell away, she saw that he'd lost weight, the ribs too prominent, the collarbones sharp, evidence of the ways he'd been consuming himself. She pressed her lips to his sternum, tasted salt and the faint bitterness of hotel soap. He shuddered, hands tightening on her waist. Mira. Her name was a question and an answer all at once. She traced kisses along the ridge of his collarbone, felt his breath stop entirely. His hands moved to her waist, thumbs pressing into the curve there with delicious pressure. She remembered this, the way he always held her as if she might dissolve, as if touch required absolute attention. "Slowly," she said, though she wasn't sure if she was speaking to him or to herself. He nodded, but his hands were already moving with aching deliberation. When he lowered his head to kiss the hollow of her neck, she arched into him, a sound escaping her that was half plea, half surrender. They finished undressing with the focused intensity of ritual. Each garment removed revealed new territory to be explored, remembered, worshipped. His gaze moved over her with such raw need that she felt it like a physical touch. He reached for her, then stopped, hands hovering. "Can I?" "Yes," she breathed. "Please, yes." His touch was reverent, exploratory, relearning the landscape of her body. She gasped, head falling back, and he took advantage, mouth finding the curve of her neck, teeth grazing skin that had forgotten this particular electricity. They had undressed with trembling urgency, the last barriers falling away with a gracelessness that made it all the more intimate. She loved him for it, for the crack in his careful control, for being human enough to be desperate. When they were finally skin to skin, the contact was almost overwhelming. She pressed against him, and the heat between them was staggering. The evidence of his desire sent warmth flooding through her entire body. His response to her touch was immediate, visceral, a groan that was the most honest sound she'd ever heard. "Mira, if you... I won't... I know," she said softly. "Bed," he managed. "Now." They fell onto the mattress in a tangle of limbs, all pretense of patience abandoned. He covered her body with his, and she welcomed the weight, the delicious pressure of him against her, his presence, his warmth, the solid reality of him. It was everything she'd been starving for. I want to know you again, he said against her ear, voice rough, every part of you. Yes, she said, though she wasn't sure she could survive the intensity of it. He kissed a slow path down her body, lingering at her neck, her collarbone, moving to her ribs, her navel, the sensitive skin of her hip bones. Every touch was deliberate, worshipful, as if he were memorizing her all over again. When his touch found her centre, she cried out, hands fisting in the sheets. He was methodical, thorough, learning her responses with the same focused attention he brought to everything. When he found the rhythm that made her hips lift helplessly, he stayed there, building sensation with devastating patience. She felt it gathering, that bright tension spiralling tighter. Her hands found his hair, and he made a satisfied sound that vibrated through her entire body. The pleasure built and built until she shattered, back-arching, a sound torn from her throat that was his name and a prayer and pure sensation. He gentled her through it, kissing her hip, her ribs, working his way back up her trembling body. When he reached her mouth, she felt desire spike, again, impossibly. I need you, she whispered, all of you. The moment of preparation was tender, fumbling, beautifully human. The vulnerability of it, the awkward necessities, somehow made it more intimate. When he settled between her thighs again, she wrapped her legs around him. He moved slowly, carefully, giving them both time to adjust, to remember this particular joining. They both went still, breathing together, overwhelmed. 13 years, he said, voice breaking. 13 years I've wanted this. I know, she whispered. I know. He began to move, and it was everything and not enough. The heat of skin on skin, the building rhythm, the way their bodies remembered how to move together even after all this time. She met him completely, holding him close, leaving marks she hoped would last for days. The pleasure built differently this time, slower, deeper, a tide rather than a wave. She felt it in every nerve, every cell, a recognition that went beyond physical, sensation. This was what she'd been missing. Not just desire, but this. Being known completely, being chosen, being held as if she mattered more than anything. Look at me, Daniel said, and she opened her eyes, met his gaze. The intimacy of it, seeing him seeing her in this moment of absolute vulnerability, nearly undid her. Don't stop, she pleaded, please don't stop. Never, he promised, and shifted, finding an angle that made stars explode behind her eyes. Is that... Yes, yes, perfect. He moved with renewed purpose, and she felt herself climbing again, higher this time, everything in her body straining toward release. When it came, she cried out, a sound he caught with his mouth, kissing her through the waves of sensation that seemed endless. She felt him follow moments later, the tension in every muscle, the way he buried his face in her neck and groaned her name like a man saved or damned. She couldn't tell which. His body shuddered, and she held him through it, hands gentle on his back, whispering words that had no meaning beyond comfort. Afterwards they lay tangled in sheets that smelled of hotel lavender, and them not speaking. His hand rested on her hip, thumb making those same small circles, her head on his chest, listening to his heartbeat slow from gallop to canter to something approaching normal. She felt marked by him, not just physically, but something deeper, as if the past 13 years had been provisional, and this was the signature that made them real. I don't know what happens now, Daniel said finally. Nothing, Mira replied. Everything. I don't know either. I can't promise I'll be better at this. At choosing. I know. She lifted her head to look at him. And I can't promise I'll forgive you the next time you choose duty over us. But maybe. She hesitated. Maybe love doesn't have to be all or nothing. Maybe it can just be what it is. Which is? This, she said simply. Right now. True. He pulled her closer, buried his face in her hair. I'll take it, he whispered. However much you can give, I'll take it. They fell asleep as the city lights came on outside, two bodies finally at rest after years of running from the same wound. Mira woke alone. For one terrible moment she thought he'd left, that the night had been a dream or a mistake or both. Then she heard water running in the bathroom, heard him humming something tuneless. The relief was disproportionate, embarrassing. She found her clothes, dressed quickly. When Daniel emerged, hair damp, shirt half buttoned, he stopped at the sight of her. You're leaving, he said. I have a clinic in 3 hours. Right, of course. He didn't move to stop her. Mira, last night was last night, she said gently. We don't have to define it. I want to see you again. You will. The world is small and we're both stubborn. She crossed to him, rose on her toes to kiss him softly. But Daniel, don't make promises you can't keep. Don't tell me you'll change your life for this. Just, she touched his face. Just let it be what it is. And what is it? Real, she said. That's enough. She left before he could argue, before either of them could complicate the simplicity they'd found. In the taxi, she watched Berlin slide past and felt something loosening in her chest. Not happiness exactly, but possibility. The acknowledgement that renunciation wasn't the only form of honour. 6 months passed. They didn't speak every day. Sometimes weeks went by with only brief emails, updates on projects, articles shared, the small gestures of continued presence. Mira treated her patients, published papers, mentored new doctors. Daniel brokered agreements, testified before committees, slowly and carefully built coalitions for the modified policy she'd opposed. And sometimes, not often, but enough, they found themselves in the same city, Geneva, Berlin, once Brussels, where they spent a single night in a hotel near the European Parliament talking until dawn about everything except whether what they had could be called a future. It was Daniel who proposed the clinic. There's funding available, he said during one of their rare phone calls, for a medical centre in one of the consolidated camps. It could be your design, your staffing model. I could help navigate the bureaucracy, but it would be yours. Why? Mira asked, suspicious of grand gestures. Because you were right, he said simply, about the cost of consolidation, about the need for local expertise, about, he paused, about most things actually. She laughed, surprised. Most things? You were wrong about one thing. What's that? You said I would leave again because that's who I am. His voice was quiet, serious. But I'm trying to learn that leaving and choosing aren't the same thing. That maybe I can do the work and love you too. That maybe, he took a breath, maybe renunciation isn't the only path to doing good. Mira sat with that for a long moment. Outside her apartment window, Berlin was settling into evening. The clinic, she said finally. Tell me more about the funding. They designed it together over the next 3 months. Video calls at odd hours, shared documents filled with their competing annotations, occasional arguments about staffing ratios that somehow always ended in laughter. When the clinic opened, a modest building with clean lines and solar panels, named simply the Community Medical Centre, with both their names listed as advisors on a small plaque by the door. Mira stood in the doorway and felt something she'd almost forgotten. Hoped that wasn't naive, but earned. Daniel couldn't attend the opening. He was testifying in The Hague about humanitarian corridor protections, but he sent a message that Mira read alone in her new office. Thank you for letting me choose this. Choose you. Choose both. She folded the message into her wallet next to a photograph of the clinic, next to a 13-year-old letter she'd finally asked him to return, still unsealed. That evening she called him. He answered on the second ring, sounding exhausted. "How did the testimony go?" she asked. "Brutal, necessary, the usual." She heard him shifting, could picture him loosening his tie. "How was the opening?" "Perfect. You would have hated the speeches," he laughed. "Probably. Mira." "I know," she said softly. "I know." "Do you? Because I'm not sure I've said it clearly enough. What you've built, what we've built, it matters more than anything I've done alone. You make me better, not just at the work, but at being..." He struggled for the word. "Human," she supplied. "Yes, that." They talked for another hour, about nothing and everything. When they finally said goodbye, Mira stood at her window watching the camp settle into evening, lights coming on in tents, children's voices raised in some game, the ordinary evidence of life persisting. She thought about Daniel in his hotel, room in The Hague, about the distance between them and the closeness that distance could no longer diminish. She thought about renunciation and how it had seemed, once, like the highest form of love. How wrong that had been, how much they'd lost believing it, but also how much they'd found in finally letting go. Love, she understood now, wasn't about choosing the world or the person. It was about allowing both to exist, to inform each other, to make demands that sometimes conflicted and sometimes aligned. It was about being brave enough to want something beyond duty, and wise enough to know that wanting didn't diminish the duty. It made it matter more. Her phone chimed. A message from Daniel. "When you're next in Geneva, I have something for you." "What is it?" she wrote back. "Time," he replied. "Just time." Mira smiled. Outside, the stars were beginning to emerge. Inside, she felt something unfurling in her chest. Not the wild hope of youth, but something steadier. The knowledge that what they'd renounced hadn't died, had only been waiting, and that what bloomed from waiting might be more resilient than anything that came easy. She wrote back, "I'll be there in 3 weeks." His response was immediate. "I'll be waiting." And for the first time in 13 years, Mira believed that waiting might finally lead to arrival. Not to a perfect ending, but to something better. A beginning that knew its own cost and chose itself anyway. Outside, the camp settled into the particular peace of evening. Inside, Mira closed her laptop and allowed herself just for a moment to imagine 3 weeks from now. Daniel's hand in hers, time that belonged to them alone, the possibility of tomorrow. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. It